After a long hiatus from the Water Resources Outlook due to active weather in the southeast, Chris and I are back to assess and forecast for the southeast rivers in the September 21st edition of the Water Resources Outlook. So the first graphic we're going to look at is the departure from normal graphic for the last 30 days of rainfall. And as you can see, due much to tropical storm and Hurricane Hermine, all depending on when that part of the coast got to see it, there's been plenty of rainfall, especially along the Atlantic coast as we get into the Carolinas, and then along the Gulf Coast as we talk about Florida. So you can see some above normal rainfall, mostly due to that. As you move a little bit further north and west of that area, you can see, especially in the Carolinas, we really dried out very quickly, and up in the mountains we've been very dry in the Carolinas and Virginia and in northern Georgia. Alabama and Mississippi have seen something very similar. Otherwise it's been kind of spotty over most of those areas. When we dig into the 90-day precipitation, you can see, especially in northern Alabama, parts of Alabama, it's been kind of spotty. We've been close to normal, with some areas above normal, some areas below. A few in Georgia, but then we've seen a little bit of a different story in the Carolinas, where we've had much above normal rainfall along the coast and in parts of western Carolina. So that's why it's not quite as bad shape. We'll see that in a drought monitor in just a little bit. And then as we get along the Gulf Coast of Florida, you can see that they've been kind of wet, and the Tampa area has been kind of wet. We'll see some spot rainfall reports here in just a little bit, but along the East Coast they have been very, very dry for most of this summer. So what has that done to our stream flows? Well, we've talked about drought before, and we'll look at the drought monitor in a moment, but the core of the drought in Georgia and eastern Alabama, and as we get up into South Carolina, has remained the same, and stream flows are indicative of that. As you get around that a little bit more in western Alabama and eastern Mississippi, we see a little bit above and below, so not quite as dire and not quite as bad as it was before. We sweep down along the Gulf Coast and into Florida, and are pretty good shape over most of Florida, except along that East Coast, where we just talked about the dry weather that was there. Get up into the Carolinas, again, right along the coast, we're very wet, and stream flows show that. And then as we move a little bit further inland, we do start to see some dryness. And that is why, when we look at the drought monitor, you can start to see abnormally dry conditions as we are in the western Carolinas, Virginia, South Carolina. Still some extreme drought in some spots in Georgia, and then very spotty as we look in Alabama. You can see previously it had been covering a good chunk of Alabama, but now it's a little bit more spotty in northern Alabama, and it's crept down to the south a little bit. And again, we still have some drought left along the Atlantic coast in the southeast. So here's a look at selected cities across the southeast and their 90-day rainfall totals compared to normal. If you can see the Birmingham, Alabama graphic here, the smooth line is the normal accumulation over that period for that particular area. And the jagged line shows the actual numbers, and below shows the precipitation and the days that they occurred on. So if the line runs parallel, that means we're running pretty close to normal. And then you'll see the jumps where it goes above normal and so forth. So we're going to look at each of these cities, and here's Birmingham. Birmingham, for the most part, has been very near normal during that time. They've had some jumps when they've had some heavy rainfall in those areas, but over the last 30 days they've actually crept down below normal. That slope has been pretty flat, and they've been a little bit drier. Atlanta shows a lot. They've had a little couple of heavy rainfall totals that have helped creep them back up to near normal, but for the most part they've stayed pretty close to below normal, and that slope of that line has stayed below. Mobile, Alabama has stayed very close to normal over the 90-day period, and Tallahassee has been slightly wet during that. We had a wet early period, and then they stayed pretty close to normal during the rest of that time. Let's head up to the Carolinas. The Charlotte, North Carolina area started off wet and then has stayed pretty dry with a couple of rainfalls during that time to help creep them closer to normal, but for the most part have stayed pretty flat. So, so not quite as wet in that area. Richmond has been started off above normal, but again has been kind of quiet, similar to what Charlotte was in the last little while. Columbia, South Carolina has stayed dry during this time with some heavy rainfall from Tropical Storm Armine as it came through, or the remnants of at that time, and so that kind of helped, I think, that time, or somewhere in that time frame. And then the Raleigh-Durham area has been above normal during that time. And the last area we'll look at is Florida, where Florida has seen near normal, at least in the middle of the month, or as we start for the first part of the 90 days, and then we did see some heavy rain around that Armine time frame. Jacksonville has been very dry. Fortunately, they've had a little bit of rain in the last couple of events and so forth, and that has helped a little, but they continue to stay dry. Orlando was dry early in the period and has gotten wetter during that time, and then Miami was close to normal and then jumped up very quickly as we got to the beginning of August, and then has trailed back. So kind of a mix when you get into that area. The last thing I show before Chris talks about the weather is kind of where we are with respect to our year and our flood climatology. We're in the heart of hurricane season. We're just at the peak and starting to come down, and so that's actually good news for some people in the southeast who've seen a little bit of tropical weather and have been kind of wet. Not so good news for those who could use some rainfall. So we'll see. We should start really ramping down and getting into a quieter part of year, kind of that late October, early November time frame, where the climatology has us being kind of dry and not seeing as nearly as many river floods.
All right, let's take a look at what we can expect for the next week across the southeast U.S. We're going to start the short-term period with an area of low pressure and a front along the coast, which is going to be bringing precipitation to the Carolinas and down into southeast Georgia. This is really going to characterize much of the short-term period. But as we go into the midterm, we're going to see the pattern switch up a bit. Going to have a cold front moving into the area from the north. Right now it does look like this will be mostly a dry front. Models just showing a little precip associated with it. But after this front, we are expecting another front to move in, this time from the northwest, and the models are showing more precip associated with this front. Now, out at the later portion of the midterm period, there's a lot more uncertainty in the timing of the front and how it moves across the area. I mentioned this because as we look at the 7-day precipitation forecast, we are showing precipitation like the upper Tombigbee into northwest Georgia, but we're not showing a whole lot at this time. Another model is a lot slower bringing that front in. It is also showing a front, but it's slower to bring that precip into the area, so there's a lot of uncertainty out at that range. Right now we are showing some precip into Alabama and northwest Georgia based on what we see late in the midterm period. And in the Carolinas we see mostly what's showing up in the short-term period associated with that front and that area of low pressure.
So let's start to look out a little bit further, and as you can see, these are our ENSO conditions. We've been talking about this for a while, and a La Nina possibly happening for this fall and winter. But even so, we've cooled off, but now we have almost a 50-50 chance of going to a La Nina. It's possible we may stay in neutral conditions, which would benefit us maybe a little bit more, and that we might see some rainfall in the southeast, more normal type rainfall as we get in. It's going to be a close call. We're still hedging towards being dry so that people can be prepared, but there is that chance that we could be a little bit more, slightly more wet. However, the official forecast out of the Climate Prediction Center rightly shows it being dry. Again, a lot of it has to do with the La Nina prediction, and we're looking at below normal precipitation for the month of October over much of Alabama, much of northern Georgia, and as we get along the Gulf Coast, not quite so, more in the equal chances range, where equal chances for below normal, near normal, or above normal. As for the October to December time frame, it's really looking like Again, La Nina conditions, dry through the southeast, and again, that's based on what we're seeing right now. It's looking very close. There is a chance, like I said, that it could be maybe not quite so dry, and that's simply because we might not be in those La Nina conditions as we head into winter. With respect to temperature, one of the things that before it looked like we were going to be above normal across the country, models are indicating that we might be in equal chances over much of the southeast, which would be good news. For much of the area that's been seeing drought, if we could see maybe more normal temperatures and maybe get near normal precipitation during that time, we might alleviate some of that drought as we go into winter. We'll have to see. We'll talk about that again in the October Water Resources Outlook. So the bottom line, in the short term, fall dryness for September into October, where we'll have a couple of fronts come through. Some are dry, some are wet, but typically during this time of year, unless we get tropical weather, we don't expect a whole lot of rain. And right now, the tropics don't look quite as active, at least for the southeast. It's possible we may still see some stuff out in the Atlantic, but those things are already looking to head to the north and stay out of the southeast. As for long term, more normal temps for late fall and into winter, continued below normal rainfall in most of in a good chunk of the drought-ridden area of the southeast, with maybe normal as we get into the fringes in North Carolina and Florida and so forth. And the drought is likely to spread. If those dry conditions continue, it's likely that those drought will spread. And we'll have to watch that, but we'll do our next water resources outlook on October 25th, and we'll address some of these issues as we approach kind of the middle of fall and kind of wane on the hurricane season. We'll talk to you again next month.